Hey guys, so today you and I are going to talk about application inventory. So let's get into it. So the question in question was, hi Frederick, what is in your opinion the best way for a software development team to manage its application inventory? McDonald's. That's going to be my answer, or rather what I call the McDonald's Principle. So basically, you've probably heard, if you're following along some of my older videos, you hear me use terms like the Batman principle or like the Joker principle or things like that. Some of these principles I make up myself. I don't know if this, again, this one I've definitely made up. I don't, there probably is an official term for this, but when I say the McDonald's principle, what I basically mean is that when you go to, it doesn't have to be McDonald's, it can be any of these fast food restaurants, right? So one of the things the fast food industry came to realize very early on was and that's not just them, of course, I think they are one of the most iconic versions of this, is that people respond really well to familiarity. Consistency is a very big thing for consumers who go to a restaurant, because you know that maybe you'd like, depending on how you feel about fast food, you know what you're going to get, and if you like the food, you know that it doesn't really matter where you go. You don't have to worry so much about differences in qualities and so forth. You sort of take away the guessing part from going to a restaurant to have a meal when you go to a fast food restaurant. And for a lot of people, that is it's actually valuable. So this old-timey idea of like this independent restaurant being so good that they can make like a big business, and then the next restaurant opens up, and then there's different management, and like that inconsistency, it actually hurts the brand for the companies. So by having very strict standards between the different restaurants, McDonald's and similar sort of food restaurants, they could build up a brand where each restaurant held the same sort of quality. And for you as a maintainer of applications and software, you should strive to do the exact same thing. The reason being is that if you have software, if you have applications that you manage in sort of the same structures, if the structures are familiar to your team and to the consumers of your applications, depending now of, you can have widely different applications, of course. I'm not saying that the user experience have to be consistent. If the system have nothing to do with each other, maybe you're working for multiple customers, that's not what you're going for. But at the code level, at the source code level, and the hosting solutions and things like that, you should strive as much as humanly possible for a consistent experience. Now, one of my favorite tools when it comes to this management of this sort of thing is Kubernetes. It is probably, in my opinion at the very least, one of the most ingenious ways of dealing with this. It's not the only thing. Chef, Ansible, like these sorts of infrastructure or like provisioning tools, they're also very, very interesting tools, because they sort of address this problem. Because back in the day, what we used to do when we were provisioning machines and dealing with hosting and so forth, was that we had like different shell scripts, and that's one of the reasons I'm actually trying to bring a few of those ideas into the code level, where I think that a lot of application developers, you create these ad hoc scripts that do something and so forth, because you have a process that you can't really remove, but you have to do it, and the manual version is bad, so you create like a script to do it a little bit faster. And I tell people, like, try to treat that as a more first-class type of citizen, because the consistency and user experience of using those tools is a very important part in scaling your system. Because if you have a lot of these ad hoc scripts, it's very difficult for you to scale that, because people forget about them, they don't treat them as something as serious code, and so they fall, they get out of sync with reality, and all of a sudden they're basically just legacy and nobody uses them anymore. And so owning your own internal process and making that a standard process is, in my experience, the key to scaling the responsibility up to multiple applications. As I said, with the fast food restaurants, they do the same thing. I'll give you a concrete example, something that I do with my team. Regardless of if we have one project or if we have 100 projects, it's the same thing. What we will always do is to establish a foundation layer of documentation for common tasks that we have to do. In other words, we create a folder or something like that called a docs folder, and in that folder are at least one. There's always one entry point, which is going to be the onboarding guide. And what is an onboarding guide? An onboarding guide is a markdown file that has first day tasks for a new hire to do. And it's a checklist, basically. That's all it is. It's just a checklist. First step, get access to this system. Get access to that system, and you just follow along. And through just following each step, you should get all the accesses to all the logging systems, to all the hosting solutions, to all the accounts, to all the things that you need to do, etc., etc. You should have, and by the time that you finish that, you should now have a full overview of all the accounts, all the services that we use, and you should have the source code and all that stuff set up on your laptop. You are now ready to start working, or as a full-fledged member of the team. The principle being basically that if you don't take the time to do that, your people will always be in an inconsistent state. Basically, some people will have access to some pieces and will be able to do certain things organically, and some will not. But it's sort of like the army. If you have soldiers, some soldiers don't know how to use a map, and some know how to use a fire, or like how to set up a fire or something like that. If you can't trust that there's a base level of understanding for what has to be done in order to maintain all of the systems, it's impossible for you to scale the team. It's going to be completely impossible, because you're going to do that thing which you're going to force to do, which is to figure out who knows what about what. And hopefully they're going to be working at the same time, so that they can sort of jump between the things that they know and that somebody else's know. And that's where I say don't do that. That's something you do with front-end development, back-end development, like the actual development process. But when it comes to maintaining the system, knowing where all the systems are, and like helping new people with these sorts of administrative work tasks type of things, there should always be a base level. Always. And from that checklist, all the other documentation grows, because you don't want to document everything, but you should document the things that actually matter. And then the same sort of consistency that I'm talking about is applicable for how you consume your systems. If you are going to create OpenAPI or Swagger files or something like that, it's the same sort of deal, right? Where that documentation is reviewed on a rotating schedule, so that you actually create that consistency. And the same thing goes for how you actually start up the project, what types of tools you use, unless you have technical requirements of like what languages you have to use. But at the very least, you're trying to move everything to a point where if you jump into the code base, this sort of feels like home, regardless of if it's one project or another project. It should feel very familiar. You know that, well, there's always going to be A, B, and C, and you're going to be able to run your commands, etc., etc. Predictability, consistency, and familiarity are the things that you are going for. And if you can achieve that, and one of my favorite ways of doing it is, for example, create a monorepo. Monorepos are great for this sort of thing, where you basically just have one single application folder, where like all your repos live in there, and then you can segment them. I mean, it's just a folder you just put your folders in another folder, and then you can have all your documentation. You can segment things on application levels. You can see all the products that you own, and I've always found that to be more effective than having like multiple repos for different projects and so forth, because it's harder for you to scale the work process of people if they need to go to a lot of different places in order to do the thing that they want to do. But if it's all centralized and segmented in the right way, you don't get spaghetti code, and you still get maximum productivity and sense of ownership, because in some cases, and this is very common I see as well, what you really want is to make sure that some projects that are being changed a lot change with the consideration of the other projects that might depend on that project, that may not change as much. Because if there's a detachment between, you work on something all the time and then you forget about the other project, they usually start rotting. You might be adding a lot of new practices and a lot of new like ideas, and maybe even breaking changes to one project, and then you retrofit it to the other projects. But if you start thinking in terms of that, there's a consistency here, like what's true for one project in terms of what makes sense, right, should scale to all the other projects as well. Well, that becomes a lot easier if you have a monorepo. And it becomes a lot easier for you to maintain a healthy code base if you start thinking in terms of, as I said, the McDonald's principle. The working in all these systems and hosting and like how we set everything up and so forth should be a basically streamlined process using tools like Terraform or Kubernetes or Docker or whatever. Deployment, standardizing your work across projects as much as humanly possible is the key. So what I want you to take away from this is very simple. If you want to manage a larger growing application inventory, the first and foremost thing you have to figure out, in my opinion, is how do I make all of this consistent? How do I make it feel familiar to work in one project and in the same way in another project? So trying to standardize the tooling and standardizing the way you document things and reviewing documentation on a regular basis, so to make sure that everybody knows how to start up everything and get the project running, etc., etc. Don't just document for the sake of documenting things, but make sure that everybody knows how to get up and running with each project and how to maintain it if it's necessary, in the same sort of way that you would for the other projects that you might be working more on. And then make sure that, as I said, deployment is super easy. Maybe use Docker, Kubernetes, similar sorts of tools, depending on how many projects you have. Make sure that you have standard, if you're working with APIs, that you're using Swagger, OpenAPI, and so forth, and that is consistent with the same sort of structures that you have on the other services that might work in the same sort of way. If there's no overlap between the systems, it's like completely different customers or something like that, it's a different story. But try to achieve that. As I said, use your North Star should be to get that level of consistency that the fast food restaurants have. They have consistent food, consistent like work practices and policies, and like all the people working in the restaurant follow the same practices. This is a proven strategy for scaling something. It works really, really well, and it's very unlikely that you're going to find some type of ad hoc way of working that is going to work better than standardizing all the things. Have a great day.